Good evening, everyone.
Who's buying a book right now?
Full house here tonight. Can everyone hear me?
His mom did art.
Thank you.
No, the one.
So welcome, everyone. We're going to get tonight's program started. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Lindsay Makowicki Capel. I'm the event manager at Bank Square Books, just right up the road, and we're honored to have all of you here with us this evening. I want to start by thanking Palmer's Provisions for being our wonderful host this evening. I want to thank all of you for coming out and joining us. Something that we like to do at Bank Square Books to thank folks for attending our events is we have event loyalty cards. So if you do come to a lot of our author talks, whether it's in the store or offsite at venues like this, we have a little rewards card where if you come to 5 events, you get $5 off your purchase at the bookstore. So see myself or Susan, we can either sign your cards or give you an event loyalty card. If you haven't purchased a copy yet of Rich's new book, we have some for sale over there after tonight's discussion, so come see us, we'll get you taken care of. And he will be sticking around up here to sign and personalize books after the event tonight. And finally, if everyone could please silence their cell phones before we begin. And I'm going to keep myself accountable here as well. Wonderful. So with all of that out of the way, this evening we're honored to host Richard J. King to talk about his new book, Sailing Alone, A Surprising History of Isolation and Survival at Sea. Rich will be in conversation with none other than Stephen Jones, and I will kick it over to Stephen to introduce Rick and get this party started. One last thing, after their discussion is over, we'll open it up to some questions from the audience. So if you raise your hand, I'll walk around with the microphone, that way we can all hear the wonderful questions you all have. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Richard J. King and Stephen Jones.
Okay, here we are. It's so good to see all you people here. I was just counting up the circumnavigators in the audience, and it's almost more than higher number than I know how to count to, but most of them are sitting at this table here. Sandy Van Zandt and Sidney Van Zandt, and there were some others in there. Oh, Howard was over there, Howard Park. And over here is Mary Russell Maynard Drake. Yes. And there may be some more.
Katrina Burke.
Oh, yes, of course, yes. Well, even if you're not a circumnavigator, you can stay. All right. I first met this gentleman here, who you might suspect is the Richard King, through this book here. It's called The Devil's Cormorant. Anyway, that's our friend out here, the Cormorant. And I came across an excerpt from this in the magazine, and I wrote him a letter. I didn't know him at all, and I said, "What are you going to do about these guys tearing down South Dumpling?" Did you ever get that letter?
Yeah.
He never answered it. This is the night to hold him accountable for all these words. Anyway, it's a wonderful book, and he's not. It starts right out here in the Gates Island, right?
Yeah.
It used to anyway, unless they changed it. All right, then he wrote another book called Lobsters. I used to think I knew a lot about lobsters because I tried to catch some here a few years. This is it's not so much how to catch them, but it's kind of iconography. Is that a word?
Yes.
The iconography of the lobster, yeah. And here is an amazing book here. It's called Ahab's Rolling Sea. And what this is the natural history of all those animals that Ahab is running into beside Moby Dick, and all the little things that live on Moby Dick, and the birds that fly over, and the one that gets nailed to the mast at the end, right? Yeah, all of that's in there. I wish that some of my English department colleagues would read this along with Moby Dick, because most of them are a bunch of lovers, and that's with a B, lovers, and they look at me and say, "Oh, you like the artifact?" That's the ship, see, the artifact. Anyway, they cook up all kinds of meaning for what Melville was in there, but if they did this, they would be better people. Okay, I first met him in person when he was down at the boatyard we have up the river, Westminster Wooden Boat, which is in Willow Point, in case you've missed it. It's easy to do. He'd been there, about a year before I even realized this guy was the same guy. Yeah, and he had his family, which I see around here somewhere.
Yeah,
Where are
they're
they?
back there.
They're over there, yes. Hi, how are you doing, dear? Yeah. So he used to come down to the boat and bail it out and things like that. And so he was a customer there first. And then one day we got to talking about boats and books. And he said he was working on this book, the one we're talking about tonight. And we got kicking that back and forth. And I said, you know, you happen to be in a town here. You've got all these circumnavigators. Did you know that then?
Not to the extent that you explained to me. Yeah.
Yes, he had a kind of uneasy feeling maybe that he was being watched by experts. He himself, of course, did research in this. We call that research, right?
Yes.
And went across the Atlantic. And he was able to do that in part because of that gentleman right over there in the red, who was his mentor. And he talks about him in this book, about the debt that he owes him to get across, and why he's still here and alive, having done that by himself. I passed out, or I had Greg Pettis, who's a good sailor himself. Where are you, Greg? Oh, there. Greg is from out of town. He's from Westerly, actually, Watch Hill, yeah. And he was good enough to pass out these little cards. Each one of you got those. And the question that's being asked here is, why would you sail alone around the world? Now, Sydney's looking at me like, "Rrr," because she refused to answer this, apparently. She claimed the Fifth Amendment or something like that. And I think we'll let her off that one because, you know, by now. Anyway, but I'd be interested to know from the rest of you what sort of thing. It's the kind of thing you can't get wrong. You don't even have to put your name on it, unless you want to copyright your answer or something like that, you know. But it might be kind of fun when we get to the next phase in here. So this is Rich King, and he's going to talk for a little while. He's got a book he's going to read. I think this is part of it, right?
Yeah.
And then afterwards, we'll have a little conversation back and forth. And then want to hear, first of all, from the circumnavigators, what sort of thing you've been provoked into by what he said, you know. And then when we hear from these people, that one over there too, we will, anybody can say anything they want to, okay? So that's sort of the structure. Rich King.
Sounds great. Thanks, Steve. Thank you. Alex, sound is okay? Well, thanks very much, Steve and Lindsay, and thanks for our books for hosting this. And it's great to see the store. Provisions really thriving here. And you know, my old landlord is here. You know, I rented on Church Street in Noank for many years. I spent most of my adult life here in Mystic and in Noank. There's a lot to talk about with Sandy and Sydney, but I'm very grateful for all your help and your friendship, and they really helped with this voyage, and many other people in the audience to thank. I'm just grateful for you all coming. And all these amazing people to hear from. So I don't want to take up too much time, but I thought that I would share the preface to this story, which will kind of set out what this project is. So it's called Sailing Alone. It came out in the UK last fall, and it came out this spring about a month ago here in the US. Different cover, but mostly the same thing. So I'll just start with the preface, and then I might have a couple things to add, and then looking forward to talking with Steve, and then just hearing from all of you about the project. My own solo crossing was not an exceptional feat of seamanship. This is not false modesty. I'm quite proud of the voyage in terms of endurance and my will and energy to make the whole adventure happen, but the passage across the Atlantic took longer than projected. I lacked the in embarrassing fashion. By the time I arrived off Cascais, my engine was dead. I navigated at that point with only a torn-out cruising guide map of the Portuguese coast, since I never expected to end up this far south. I was aiming for Scotland, just so we're clear. That final morning, after one of the hardest nights of the trip, I saw mountain peaks above the haze. Elated, I shouted to escorts of surfing dolphins and careening brown seabirds. Even as I sailed beside a string of puzzling yellow buoys, conjuring dangerous possibilities of getting tangled in fishing gear or drifting into a military testing zone, I still knew it was over. I had completed my single-handed passage across the Atlantic Ocean. Without a working engine, though, I had to short tack up to the marina where two men who zoomed out in an inflatable boat tolerated my few words of Spanish, since I knew no Portuguese, before briskly towing me inside the high walls and around to a berth at the dock after 5 weeks at sea by myself. I was physically exhausted, emotionally spent, and paralytically rattled from the entire experience. I rationalized that I had to get back home to my job. I did not have any difficulty going out to the ocean again, even within a year, but I returned only to larger ships. I have not been on the water sailing by myself since I sold my boat. By the way, I sailed out of Wes's shipyard down in Noank. This is a Pearson 28 that I bought here in Noank. Now, over 15 years later, either at sea or ashore, there is sometimes a particular level of wind, a decibel or tone of wind, a specific sound and volume of angry, grasping, howling, relentless wind through a boat's rigging or through trees or even across the clapboards of my house that sends me back to being aboard my 28-foot sloop in one of those gales in the North Atlantic. When I hear that particular level of wind, I am again looking out of my porthole aboard Fox. I feel afraid again. I start going over scenarios again, what to do if X breaks or Y happens. I think of that tiny black storm petrel veering sidelong across my wake, either in its element or also entirely terrified and out of control. I couldn't tell which. It takes several hours for my fear of that certain sound of wind to fade. I've never talked out loud about this fear of wind, I guess I am now, never mentioned this lingering emotion to anyone, even to my family. In other words, this book is not the story of individual excellence, nor is it a compendium of sailing records or a practical manual on how to do it if you're considering a solo voyage yourself. Sailing Alone, this book, is the exploration, firstly, of why go. I wanted to find out why other people have committed, exiled themselves into small boats alone on the surface of the open ocean. Among those of Western backgrounds, single-handed ocean sailing began in the late 1800s. Individual and collective motivations to cross an ocean alone have shifted over time as solo sailors responded to social, political, and environmental movements. And telling the history of human reasoning for doing this sort of thing requires a parade of wonderfully compelling and surprisingly different characters, who inevitably raise universal questions for all of us ashore about the choice of an adventure of any kind, about legacy, individualism, and the choice of solitude, whether you're on a boat or not. Secondly, Sailing Alone is the story of what they saw. I wanted to know what other solo sailors observed out there in their small, slow boats so close to the surface, tracing their transects across the sea. Although their observations are inevitably anecdotal, and they as witnesses are not always reliable, single-handed sailors have provided useful glimpses into the changing global ocean, the most inaccessible, most unknown, yet most influential set of ecosystems on our planet. Sailors alone at sea, at single locations and times, have recorded snapshots, for example, from under the shadow of a blue iceberg, or while skimming over a coral reef, or when gazing over the rail at night upon milky seas of bioluminescence. Solo sailors have described at different locations and times, sailing through schools of flying squid, watching ribbons of thousands of shearwaters, or feeling the bumps of great white sharks rubbing their backs on the bottoms of their boats. The motivations of single-handed sailors and their previous readings shaped what they saw, felt, what they heard, what they smelled, tasted, and how they decided to write about the open ocean environment when they came home. Sailing Alone is as much of a literary study as it is just a straight-up history, because all of these writers have written these narratives, they've read other narratives, and they're often going to sea for the very purpose of writing a narrative. And so it becomes this cycle of literary influence. The observations of these sailors, of seabirds, sharks, fish, turtles, and whales, have in turn influenced our cultural perceptions of groups of these animals, as well as more broadly in terms of our relationship with the ocean. Meanwhile, technological developments, such as the marine engine, self-steering, photography, and GPS, have in turn influenced the single-handed mariner's observations. Solo sailors stand as channel markers for our larger marine conservation movements, although their shift to environmental activism happened later than you might expect. Thirdly, this study, this history titled Sailing Alone, is about my own relatively minor voyage within those two terms of inquiry, the why go and the what they saw, which leads directly, physically, chronologically, and metaphorically, back to that singular moment when I rolled out of my bunk and climbed into the cockpit to the greatest shock of my life. I'm trying here to parse the facts and the meanings from what exactly happened on that windy, overcast afternoon in the Canary Current at approximately 16:05 local time when I stared up at that rumbling wall of red. That's the preface to Sailing Alone. And I go through the book and sort of really, it's not everybody that sailed alone. It's not everybody that circumnavigated. It's a sort of curated collection telling the stories of people that represented time periods, represented different types of sailors, whether they were cruisers, whether they were racers, coming from different backgrounds, different nationalities, and moving through chronologically through time as I use my own story to kind of thread that together. And I think that maybe that's all I'll share for right now, and then you and I can talk just a little bit.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think what's sort of hovering over this is sort of the ideal voyage. You know, we're all sort of Platonic in that sense, the ideal dog or something, you know. What is the defining sailing, circumnavigating? Of course, most everybody would say, who's looked into this at all, would say it's Joshua Slocum sort of started this off. And I forgot to mention this, but I will tell it now, that boat that he had, the Spray, was built here in Noank. If you look at that picture there, that over Howard's head there, the steel engraving of the Palmer shipyard, you will see the yard at its largest there. I'm not saying that Spray was built there. That would be kind of like building an electric boat or something of its day. It probably was built in somebody's backyard. We don't know. But if you read the Slocum book, Sailing Alone Around the World, he's just used the first part. He ran out of ink. And you'll find it's not in the beginning where you would think it would be, because Slocum starts off that book talking about finding this old beat-up oyster boat in Fairhaven, which is across from from Bedford. Bedford, yeah. And I went over there one time, and it's still there. I mean, that part of the land, it's a very residential now, and there's a little sign there. It's north of the I-95, where that yard used to be. There's a wonderful picture of that in the first edition of him in that yard, with everyone very skeptical about how he was caulking the boat and so forth. But that boat was built to go oyster fishing out here, right where you see Jim Mark out doing that today in the big stainless steel boat, right out on the grounds here. That much is for sure. And when Mary Maynard and her family decided to get in the Slocum business, and he was very much influenced, wasn't he, by Joshua. He used to sit there with that hot black derby hat on, taillights, which was Joshua Slocum's trademark. And so we know that he was influenced by him, and he would talk about him and so forth. He built as close as he could get to it. Didn't he try to do that? Yeah. And he lofted it right upstairs, as you told us last week, right over there, right? In Sandy's sail loft. And then he built it in the garden back of Carson's, and eventually launched it down here at that shipyard, not looking like that then, of course. And then he persuaded, and 3 kids, they were all what, under 14 or something, right?
8, 10, and 11.
Yeah. And they went off. And we all sort of went, bye. Will we ever see these people again? Yes.
It was your son who said that at the launching. He said, I really hope they come back. And when he was up on the podium.
Yeah. But anyway, the question here is, you know, what makes for Because some of the people in this book, it's interesting to read about, but you think, that's not what it's about. You get these people in these plastic boats and all these things. I mean, even the Mainers didn't even have a RDF or Loran or any of that kind of stuff, right? You told me the other day you did have a radio, but it only received. Think of that. You're sinking. Well, I wonder what they're doing on other places where they're not sinking, you know? Yeah, and you had no engine, right? That saved a lot of worry.
Seems a lot of worry.
And expense.
Yeah, he had a long oar though, right, which was what, two of them, okay, one per, which you can, that's all right as long as the wind's not blowing much, right? It's just that little bet when the wind is dying at the end of the day, and you gotta get to the anchorage, I did that one time when the boat was up. But man, you know, when there are situations obviously where that wouldn't work very well. So they were very close to imitating the Slocum thing, although they had the whole family, the Swiss Family Robinson thing with them. So what was important, is it the alone part here, or is it the around part? I tend to think that it's the around part. And even people that take their whole family spend a lot of time alone, you know, at night on the wheel, and those people, you know, they're still down there, you know. I don't, did Nate make it here from Benjamin? I don't see him. He was going to, from Martha's Vineyard, he's in town here for the wooden boat thing, and he was going to come over here. He's just finished a manuscript about sailing with one other guy back from Europe, started in Malta and ended up at the Idlewild Yacht Club. And it was basically a two-man voyage except the night that the guy fell overboard. The other guy. Does that constitute a loan? You know, the funny thing, I was reading that manuscript, and the guy fell overboard, and you're going like, and then he jumps to the idle. He didn't tell us yet, but we'll get a hold of him and make him fill that out. But obviously, he got the guy back somehow. But what is more, you know, a horrible situation than to come on deck and find, you know, you're alone. And you don't know when the guy went overboard, and you're in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, sailing alone, right? Yeah. You didn't have to worry about that.
No.
No. Well, Rich, what do you think about this ideal thing? Is that just something we shouldn't worry about?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting question, and particularly when there's so many experienced sailors here that have gone on these big voyages, and some people perhaps who have never gone sailing. You know, what is an authentic voyage? What is considered a voyage that we can be proud of? And one of the things that the study looked at is sort of, you know, how technology has changed our interaction with the ocean, whether it's the marine engine, obviously is going to be huge, fiberglass, GPS, satellite phone coming up in, you know, the ability. I was sort of right on the edge of that, where for my short trip, I was able to rent a satellite phone. And I was fortunate that my girlfriend, now spouse, Lisa Gilbert, was able to talk to me once a day and share weather and be able to just ground me for that 2-minute time. And now today, obviously, you can contact all the time, have electronic charts. So that is something that the study traces and kind of looks at the ability and how and the accessibility for various people to get out to sea and to go on these voyages. Slocum is a really interesting one. Of course, he's sort of like the iconic, you know, original gangster of sailing alone. But one thing that I find really interesting about Slocum is that he was sort of very intentional about being a writer from the start. And he was one of the first. Solo sailing had started in the late 1700s. Our sort of first record of somebody sailing alone was a Revolutionary War veteran, Josiah Shackford, who had sailed from France to Suriname. And basically, he had two people on. He had a crew member on board. They got out into the harbor, and the crew member was like, "I really don't want to do this." And he was like, "Fine, get off, and I'm just going to go do this." And so we did. But it wasn't like a big deal. There was a few things in the newspaper, but he never wrote anything about it. We don't have any letters from it. We just had these newspaper accounts. And so how did we get from Josiah Shackford to a point where we actually respect somebody who went sailing alone by themselves instead of thinking they're just like a nut job and they've just like why are they going by themselves and sailing alone? It seems ridiculous. And so you can kind of trace the Josiah Shackford moving up into Joshua Slocum. And Joshua Slocum wasn't the first to write a narrative about it, but he was the first person not only to do all the extraordinary things he did as a mariner, because he was experienced as a merchant ship captain, because he was a boat builder, but also because he was a writer. And he had written 2 narratives before, many of you know about, before he left. And he went into that trip from the start planning to write the book. He had contracts with newspapers in the US to send back articles. He had a camera, which is something that kind of we never even think about that Slocum would have had. And so that sort of idea of going on the voyage and planning to sort of blog about it or send a video, some of us today are sort of skeptical of that sort of expedition, but that's been the story from the start. Just the pace of it, obviously, is much faster now. So Slocum is really an extraordinary benchmark, and he's used in the book both for his storytelling, what he did, how he influenced others, as well as his observation of the natural environment, his perception of sharks, what he saw of whales, how he used seabirds for coastal navigation, his recognition of different species in relation to latitude. Obviously, a really extraordinary person, but I certainly wouldn't judge the authenticity of anybody who's going out there and having fun. Good on you, yeah.
Yeah, you're not a circumnavigator snob.
I am definitely not. I'm not a circumnavigator, and yeah, and yeah.
Another aspect of this is stopping off. I don't mean what my uncle meant by that. He meant, stopping off on the way home. You know what I mean? Stopping off. Yeah. No, stopping off at islands and things like that, which is so much part of the charm of these earlier books. For instance, Harry Pigeon, who was the second sailor to do this sort of thing. He got his design out of Rudder magazine. Thomas Fleming Day was a promoter of yachts going long distances, by which he usually meant across the Atlantic. So this guy was a Pigeon. He was a farmer really out in Dakota or one of those places, and a long way from the sea, just the opposite of Slocum, who grew up by the sea and was a professional deep water mariner, ran clipper ships. I think the ultimate Slocum clipper ship story is he's coming into Yokohama Harbor, which is the harbor for Tokyo, in a 3-masted vessel with his wife playing the grand piano. But, I mean, how can you beat that? You never had her play the grand piano, did you, Sandy? The dulcimer. Yeah, okay. That's your instrument, yeah. So, I mean, you start with that. She's telling what I said. Then you get towards the end of Rich's book here, and you get these people. My favorite example of the anti-Slocum about stopping off, and Harry Pigeon, of course, stopped off many places along the line. And indeed, the Maynards, right? You guys spent a year here and a year there. You guys did that. Put the kids through school in some of the places and stuff. You weren't trying to set a record. But towards the end of Rich's book, recently, we have at least 2 young high school girls who are doing this in these modern boats. And my favorite example of that is the mother of one of them says, "Now, don't you be stopping off any of those places. Just keep going. Never mind the palm trees and like that. You just keep going. And then I will give permission for you to go." So around they go. Of course, the guy that really made that famous was Sir Francis Chichester, who was an airplane guy. I mean, basically, wasn't he an airplane guy?
He started, yeah.
Yeah, he had a boat called the Gypsy Moth. I had a chance to see that one time. I was over in Greenwich, down the river from London, at the museum there, and I was aboard the Cutty Sark, which is a Northern Lights type, magnificent vessel. Those of you that drink scotch know what the Cutty Sark is. It's the same bunch. Yeah. And I'm on that thing, and I was the only guy on there because it was a miserable British day, with a shit coming down, which was nice because there's just the keeper there. And I'm looking down over there, and here's this thing down on a big cement pad, and that was the Gypsy Moth. And I was thinking, but there it was, right next to the Cutty Sark, and he started that sort of thing. Then they said, okay, that's the next mark. And there's a sort of setting of benchmarks kind of here, isn't there? Yeah. And it gets into this competitive kind of thing, like the Olympics. Next event is sailing alone around the world, And he sort of started that whole thing off. What do you think about the business of stopping off?
Yeah, so in the history of sailing alone, there's a couple sort of bifurcations. One of them is sort of the cruisers and the racers, right? And many of you now are sort of familiar with the Vendée Globes and these enormous vessels. I talk a lot about Ellen MacArthur and her ability to sail over 20 knots for 60 days in a row. Extraordinary speeds, high-tech vessels, need of multi-million-dollar sponsorships. While at the same time you have the cruisers, right? Most of the audience here are cruisers. Doing the repairs themselves, raising money themselves, going from place to place, very much as much for the sailing adventure as the opportunity to see the world. And that bifurcation kind of comes around in the 1960s. There's this huge pulse of people going to sea, some for solo sailing, but also just to go to sea. After the Second World War, a lot of people, they're sort of referred to sort of the sea gypsy generation. People just have seen what we can do as humans to each other. They've seen the devastation of all the world wars, and they're going to the ocean to sort of find that respite, to go to see that space, to see this as a last sort of location where people can get away. And Harry Pigeon in the 1920s that Steve was talking about had a similar sort of concept. He actually built his boat during the Spanish flu pandemic in LA. And he's sitting there and, hundreds of thousands of people around the world were dying. He was building his boat from his amateur magazine, just wanting to get out of there. You know what I mean? But he really wanted to see the world. Being a mariner wasn't his major concept. So in the 1960s, Sir Francis Chichester is a really extraordinary character, and there's a photograph in the book that you can see where after Chichester gets back, he sails around the world with one stop in Australia. He is received by the Queen. He is knighted. Millions of people come out on the streets, and there he is up in London, holding this trophy, and you just see all of these people in the streets. The hero, Sir Francis Chichester. And we've moved from Slocum, who arrives, back into Fairhaven with just nobody even there, at the dock. He's just tying himself up, and then he goes, doesn't call anybody, goes and writes and tries to tell people that he's ashore. And so the transition happens really quickly. And so you have this bifurcation of cruisers to racers, and then you've got this concept of people that are stopping in port or sailing alone nonstop. Right after Chichester in the 1960s, there's that famous Golden Globe race in 1968, where many of you might be familiar with, of where people are trying to be the first to sail alone around nonstop. To the point where, just like Steve said, and I kind of love Jessica Watson. I don't know if you've seen the Netflix series. Her book is really extraordinary. She was the most popular blogger in Australia at the time, about 2010. That she was a teenager, the youngest person at the time to sail solo around the world by herself. She had a very traditional full-keeled boat. I think it was about 32 feet, and she was on the satellite phone every day. And she was putting videos, and you read her book, it's really well done, putting the blogs together, and it has QR codes where you can, check out your phone and see the little videos. And there's, I'm sure there's an element of skepticism in the audience, like, oh, how dare she, have videos. But she was a really extraordinary communicator. And same kind of thing, she returned back to Sydney, Australia. The biggest parade you've ever seen, around the Sydney Opera House, touched millions of people around the world, gave so many young people the sort of emotion that hey, maybe I could do something big in my life, whether it's sailing or whether it's, going to university. And so I'm really inspired by a lot of those individuals, and it's interesting to trace how the technology fits into it, as well as the choices that these sailors make, whether it's to stop in ports, to go sailing alone around the, with nonstop, or if they move more into a racing era, or kind of more into a cruising realm.
Sort of a Taylor Swift of navigation.
Yeah. I think that's a great example.
Every day Taylor's on the machine there, where the tight end is standing, and he's knowing how he's over there, and all these little minutiae, of stuff. It became a, as we say, a rock star. Yeah.
Yeah. So Steve had sent around some cards asking people why they would sail alone around the world, and we've received some really fantastic responses. I'm only reading them. Can I reveal why?
Sure.
Yes, because Steve doesn't have his glasses. Response number one, I would not. I love being at sea, out of sight of land, but I prefer a boat, maybe a schooner, with other people sharing the work and keeping us all safe. I would sail around the world alone for self-reflection, to see it all. Have you met my spouse? Discuss. This is in here of personal relationships because I'm still able to. For the fame and glory, and to see if you can. To conquer a fear. I wouldn't, because it's an adventure to be shared. As I did when we, can I reveal the name? When we Maynards sailed our home-built wooden engineless spray copy around the world 1973 to 78, Noank to Noank. So it is some, well, would you want
Go ahead.
yeah, in that sort of talking to, reading narratives and talking to sailors who had gone alone around the world or crossed major oceans by themselves, it is a real question of like, why choose solitude? Why go on your own? And all of these responses are in these sailors. And sometimes they're quite candid about it. And sometimes you have to read in between the lines, like Joshua Slocum, in terms of how his relationship with his second wife was going. I framed the book with Ann Davidson, who was the first woman that we know of to sail alone across an ocean. She was part of that Sea Gypsy post-war generation. She and her husband had restored a fishing boat in England. They literally were in debt so far that they escaped off the dock, and they were hoping to just get to the Caribbean so that they could sell the boat and at least just get away from England where creditors were after them. In about 5 days, things went just terrible. Fog, bad navigation, bad engine. They ended up on the rocks in the English Channel. The boat was in danger. Both of them jumped overboard into their life raft. They got caught in the currents, and her husband drowned. Ann Davidson crawled up onto the beach, and as she described it, as soon as she got onto the beach, she was like, I know this is not going to be my last experience with the ocean. 3 years later, she was on her own boat, almost to the day that her husband had died, sailing off by herself in, I think it was a tiny boat, maybe 26 foot, the Felicity Ann, and sailing, and it took her a while, and she had various mishaps, but she wrote the most beautiful book that has just come back in print. It's called My Ship Is So Small. And what's so extraordinary about her narrative is how honest she is from the start about why she went. This wasn't a bucket list adventure. It wasn't because she was trying to sort of make any feminist statement in 1952. She really just she was like, I wanted the little house. I wanted to just have my own space. I wanted to travel. I wanted to be by myself, partly so I wouldn't be responsible for anybody else. And she also was like, I'm kind of a writer now, and I need something to write about, and this should provide some good adventure. And she writes it just so beautifully and eloquently, and describes a really slow, difficult passage across the Atlantic, because it was one of those years where the trade winds just weren't there. And same kind of thing. She had no radio whatsoever, no GPS, no weather information. And it's a beautiful book, so I recommend it. And it's something that I talk about sort of throughout the book, using her in the beginning and then using her at the end, someone wrote in here about courage, and it's something she talks a lot about, of courage and fear and what it means to push yourself to do something that you might be afraid of, and whether that has value or not for depending on the individual.
Yeah, I was thinking of Lloyd Bergeson. Some of you knew him. You lived right across the street from him. Lloyd was a number 3 or something in Electric Boat, who people count that ladder. He was way up there. He had a lot of people working for him. And when he retired, or at least one point in his life, he decided to sail back to Norway, where his people had come from, originally his heritage. And he had this boat called the Cockatoo, which was one of these skinny Harrisoft things. It was really a glorified day sailor, competitive, it had all the racing kind of things that you do to a boat to make it go fast, which usually make it very unsuitable for this kind of voyage. And he went across in that. And he told me the reason he didn't take anybody with him, he took his son Henry, I think on the way back, is that right? Yeah. Anyway, the reason he didn't take anybody over, he says, because he was tired of bossing people around. They never did what he said anyway, so what the hell, what fun was that? And so he went over there, and way coming back, he was with Henry, who was his son, who was used to be. I saw Henry on Front Street one time, and I said, Henry, I knew you when you were a little kid. He says, I never was a little kid. So Henry got to be less of a little kid, and he was over with his father, big strong. He now makes kaleidoscopes, right? Somebody's got to do that. He lives in Colorado, which is not on the sea, is it? No. Anyway, so they're coming back, and they decided that the boat was sinking, and so they had an EPIRB. And technical, as adept as Lloyd was, MIT thinks he used to write these brilliant papers. He didn't know how to run the EPIRB, so he got mad at the damn thing. EPIRB is emergency position thing. It talks to a satellite who talks to an airplane who talks to a ship and saves your life if you do it right. So he got mad at the thing because it wouldn't turn on, so he threw it in the water. That's how you turn it on. And so all that plugged in, and next thing there was a great big ship coming alongside, and the men came down in rope ladders, and they had wrenches and things. They started taking the boat apart. He thought, well, what can I say? And they put all the stuff, all the wonderful Harrisoft hardware in there, and winches and things. They took them up there, and they said, well, come on. And so there goes the Cockatoo sailing off into the gloom with its cabin lights still on. And as far as we know, it's still out there. And sometimes you get off too soon. And but all that hardware, they gave it back to the Furberger. So they were just saving it for them. They weren't stealing it from them. And so, but you never know, because you don't know how these things are going to turn out, right? Just a bunch of strange people come down and start taking your boat apart. You don't know, we'd like to get a little money for that cleat, maybe. Anyway, so that's the kind of thing that happens. I sailed alone, Lloyd would say, because I started bossing people around. Yeah. Do you guys have anything that can contribute there, Sydney or Sandy, about your thoughts about, how long did you take? 5 years, something like that?
We lived on board for 14 years.
14 years. Well, you did a bunch of voyages, right? I was on the tail end of one of them, but we're coming up the Dismal Swamp Canal, these two guys and me, in the boat that Sandy designed and had built down in Deltaville, because that's the only place they were building steel boats. And yeah, and we were in the lock waiting for the thing to change. That's good, yeah. Yeah, and remember that morning? Sandy was down below, and he was working on the engine, and you were flossing your teeth. Right across. Well, that's nothing to be ashamed of. That's a good example. And so I had my back to here, and I was looking at you, and you started to giggle. She's not usually a giggling kind of person, right? And she said, I turned around, and right over there in the bank was this big, tall, hoopy kind of guy with a rotten fur coat on. Looked like he'd slept in it all night, which he had. And he's going along on his back. There's a big brown bear. It couldn't have been brown. It must have been black. You don't remember any of this? Well, it was there. Anyway, The thing that made me nervous is the night before, there's this blood-curdling scream, like you never heard even from Fay Ray, you know, and when she's being carried away. And it just was in the middle of the night, it was like, whoa, you know. And what was that? We don't know. But the next thing we see, you know, hours later is this guy, places to go, people to see. He's late for work, right? This bear is walking along the corner there. And anyway, the adventures with Sydney and Sandy in confined waters, yes, which they don't remember. That's why we have these meetings, so I can tell them what we used to do. All right, okay. Mary, you've had, that was it? That's all you wanted to say? You didn't remember the bear? Bear. Elephant?
The sound that's back here blocks my hearing.
You're the thing back. She's on here.
I don't know what you're talking, what's your question?
Well, you tell about your, go ahead, whatever you want. Sing Star Spangled Banner.
I think the thing that's important here is that in this book, there was a wind vane that was called Sandy. And all through the book, he referred to this sailmaker, Sandy, who spoke to him when he was getting his boat ready to sail across, and then showed him how to use the wind vane, and then built a fitting on the tiller. And then, if you follow through in the middle of the book, he's thrown out of his bunk because the wind vane had jibed, and wind vanes do not jibe. And then he gets up on the deck and he sees this giant red ship that was 700 feet long. And if that boat hadn't jibed, he would have been way underwater. But what he figured was that the wind hit the side of the ship, went up and over, and it jibed. But then he says something that he never admitted to anyone before, was that he bet that Sandy Van Zandt, who he had referred to, had helped him do the wind vane, had been standing in Mason's Island and looked out to sea, and he said, that young man is in deep trouble. And so he put his hand on the railing of the building that he was on, and he says in this story that when Sandy put his hand on the railing, that hand went also to the railing on his ship, and it jibed it. And then you refer to it on the last page that you can do it if you have help and people along the way to help you. And so it was, to me, reading that book with Sandy through it, working with you and the wind vane and all the various people who have been able to single-hand sail, and your wonderful reference to this guy, Sandy Van Zandt here, who was a spirit, maybe, throughout that book.
Why don't you give, yeah.
And we went because we're not single. In 1955, we were married, so that was 68 years ago. So there wasn't going to be any single-handed sailing in this family. It was double-handed sailing. And then, as I would say, when somebody would say, you sailed around the world, I said, yes, but first you've got to build the boat. So that was a whole experience down in Virginia, and it pulled our son Douglas all the way from the West Coast to help do a lot of the rigging and do a lot of work with us. And so there were actually, at the end, there were three of us. But so we were sailors back when in 1982 we set off on our trip, a 6.5-year circumnavigation. But we stopped places and we met people. And sometimes in the Pacific we would go into islands, and we were just adopted at many of the islands. Down in the Bahamas, we came back at the end of our trip, and they'd say, hey, welcome home. And so then we would go back into their lives again. So, but when you go out, you get to meet a lot of wonderful people. But at any rate, this was a twosome, involved with the sailmaker here and the designer. He's just gonna look at this thing and not want to say anything.
And give it to Howard. Give it to Howard, yeah.
Hello, I'm Howard Park, and I did circumnavigate on a old wooden boat. It was a CCA yawl designed by Augie Nielsen, 52-foot boat. I did I did 15,000 miles of that trip alone. One of the passages from St. Helena to Trinidad was nonstop. The breeze was fantastic. That was 22 days nonstop, and I told my wife when she came down to the islands to meet me that if I say I'm going to do 22 days again, remind me that that's too long. And after she'd been there for a week, I said, I bet I could do 25 days. So that's what happens when you do sail alone. One of the big things about our trip is returning to the Mystic Seaport in time for the Mystic Seaport Designer Awards, and it happened to be for Sparkman and Stevens. Now, Augie Nielsen designed that boat for Sparkman and Stevens, and Comet was just a super boat, wonderfully built and strong boat, very healthy boat. So, Olin would look down on that boat in the morning, and I'd come up from below, and I'd see him there looking at that boat. It was an amazing thing. He knew everything about it and how it was built and who had owned it, et cetera, et cetera. And he wrote us a very nice letter, which in part said, it's extraordinary how an ordinary boat can be sailed around the world with little fanfare or fuss by a couple of ordinary people.
Howard, can you give it to Stuart? Stuart! Yeah, give it to Stuart in the back. He's got his back to the wall, literally and metaphorically.
I have no idea what to say. You're talking about sailing. I guess I spent most of my life sailing. I think I got into it a little bit different than most people did. I started working with some back in the 70s and the early 80s. I couldn't find work. So I ended up delivering boats with some fellas that were doing that for a living, and then I bought a sailboat, and I found I could live on it. It was a lot cheaper than living in a house. I didn't have to work as hard. So I traveled with the boat, and you were talking about solo sailing, and I guess I've done a lot of that, only because I could never find anybody to go with me before I wanted to go. I never saw the philosophical beauty of it, I don't think, until afterwards when I thought about it. But I've kept on doing it. I'm still doing it now. I'm not taking trips like I used to, but I mean, it beats working for a living. So I don't know what else to say. You can give it to somebody else. Thank you very much.
I thought you were going to tell us about the time that your guy fell overboard.
Did you all?
Which one?
Who fell?
Story you told me years ago about how you were out here and the guy fell. Stuart had a philosophy that if you, hiring a crew by Stuart, this is Stuart Renninger anyway, who's a professional sailor and writer of books and things like that. In fact, if I didn't embarrass him, he's an expert actually. Yeah. Anyway, Stuart has taken a lot of long trips that so many he can't sort them out at the moment, I guess, including across the Atlantic with your daughter, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, oh yeah. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that? Give him back the mic there.
Saint-Gilles-la-Vie is where they built Benettos. And I was hired by the Beneteau, an agent actually, through the Beneteau. The Beneteau wanted to advertise their boats as ocean proven. So they hired me to bring one of the first 42, they called it the first 42 Beneteau. It was about 1982. So I hooked up with my daughter, who had escaped and had been sailing, had been running around through Europe because we had, I don't want to make a short story long, but her and I had visited Europe, and she decided to stay, and I had to go back to work. So the only way I can get her to come back to the States was to induce her to come with me, and we picked up this Beneteau, and the thing wasn't ready to sail when it was supposed to in September. We ended up leaving France in November. I believe it was the 12th of November, in the eye of, we waited and waited and waited for a weather window, and they kept on saying things like force 10, force 11, force 12, which is a hurricane. And finally, we took off in a force 8, and we made a 32-day crossing to finally to West Palm, where we was going to bring the boat. But that was, the Beneteau decided not to do that anymore because we destroyed the sails. The boat was a wreck by the time we brought it back. And then I believe it or not, I did 2 more after that, crew with 2 other people. And then Beneteau decided they would pedal their boats another way instead of trying to prove that they were ocean-proven. I'll tell you one more very quick story while we're sitting here in Noank. The only time I almost died on a boat was right here on Sandy Van Zant's mooring, which he let me use his mooring. This must have been 15 with the boat I have now. And I was on the mooring, it was blowing and I put the sail up because I had a reef line that wasn't, I had just sailed over from New London, I believe, and I was on the mooring and I'm going to correct that reef line, so I put the sail up. Sails is supposed to be blowing 20 knots out there, but I wanted to catch that reef line. Next thing I remember, I'm upside down in the water, bleeding like a stuck pig, stuck in the life lines, and I was knocked overboard by the boom. And I managed to crawl back on the boat, lower the sail, and then roll myself. I'm making a long story short. I ended up in the hospital with a concussion for 3 days. And I still don't remember how I got out from the boat, climbed on the deck, lowered the sail, and rowed myself in. And to a very angry girlfriend who was waiting for me, who thought I was playing with the sail while she was cooling her heels. We were going to take off for the weekend. Anyway, that's all I have to say.
Anybody else?
Hi, I'm Katrina, and my family from 1971 to 75 sailed around the world on a 38-foot Seawolf ketch out of Santa Barbara, California, sailing mostly in the tropics, and my dad liked to go barefoot, so we mostly were places where that was the thing to do. And we had 3 kids. I was the middle of 3 kids. We were 10, 15, and 16 when we left. And, by the time we got back, we're like, the older ones, 19 and 20, my mom says, it's still my galley. And you think you're grown up, but you're really still the kids. So that worked out. And then afterwards, we have done slide lectures and stuff, but people said, are you going to write a book? And we said, well, we never really had the big moment where the ship was in danger and people falling overboard and everything. So we don't really think that we'll write the book. We don't really think it would sell, but it was a good adventure. And I remember my takeaway was, and this reflects back to what Rich was saying about people going after a war. We were in that situation, but we said, well, what did you think? And it's like, the world is so full of good people. Everywhere we went, people were so kind to us, so hospitable, and invite us over. We'd say, can we bring a towel and take a shower while we visit you there? And this is my friend Mary Drake, who did it without an engine and built her own boat, which we did neither of those things. So she's one-upped me.
Sorry about that. Katrina forgot to mention that her father had sailed with Irving Johnson. And that's where he got his inspiration to take his family. Ours, we decided to sail around the world while we were taking a Volkswagen camper trip to Alaska. We wanted to go around the world, and the only way to do it financially was build our own boat. but it took 13 years to get there and to come to Noank, where they had the expertise, which we did not, being from Illinois. But with the help of Sandy and Sydney Van Sant, Sydney's Rosie the Riveter with a drill. I got the picture of you drilling holes for the frames. And the rest of the villagers who emptied their garages and their attics for gear that would be suitable for a 19th century 37-foot boat. And we couldn't have done it without the no-anchors. You know, we blustered our way through, and as someone very intelligent said, you made it in spite of yourselves, not because of your knowledge. And that's pretty true. 5 years, we never had a really bad storm except the first night out of Block Island. And we stayed a year in the Azores. Fantastic medieval culture. A year in American Samoa, which is just like Doonesbury wrote about it. And another year in Australia. And we went around Cape of Good Hope. We sailed around the Cape of Good Hope. We got into Cape Town, where we met Pat Cullen again from Sandefjord, who was here. And we were in the harbor when a Bermuda 40 came in under power, all tattered sails. We had been with them many places. And they said, "How did you get here?" We sailed. And then when we left Cape Town, we went right to Block Island because we were totally out of money. And that was the reason to take the boat in the first place. I mean, sure, the travelage, but that was financially the only way we could do it. And it was well worth every dime that we spent, and probably a lot more that we didn't.
John, do you have anything, John?
Me?
You, yeah.
I was in the steam all the time.
John is the historian for the Noank Historical Society and is a walking compendium. It has many stories about long voyages. In the old days, not at the moment. He just got back from Pennsylvania or someplace. Okay, I just thought I'd give you a chance. Anybody else?
See what happened to the guy that fell overboard.
Which one?
I don't know. I said the guy fell overboard. Two guys sailing together, one fell overboard. What happened?
I don't know, except he ended up at the Ida Lewis Yacht Club, Soggy. I got to find out from him. He was supposed to be here tonight, but maybe he fell overboard. Yeah, so this can happen. I'll let you know when I know, John.
We have time for a couple questions from anybody? Thoughts? Anybody else want to add anything?
Okay, we got something down there. Where's our mic lady?
Wonderful book. I bought the UK version before it was out.
Oh, thanks.
What was your experience?
Wait a minute, we can't hear you. Look at somebody.
Thanks. What was your level of expertise or experience, before you went? What made you think that you were qualified to do this?
Yeah, fair question. And, it's interesting talking about why people go. Naomi James, the first woman to sail with one stop out of New Zealand, talked about that she wanted to go because she didn't want anybody over her shoulder sort of trying to mansplain, to her. And she just wanted to go out and have that experience. And I would say for me, pretty similar. I learn pretty slowly. I kind of have to learn things by myself in a slow way. And so going to sea by myself was actually a good way for me to learn. I'd spent a lot of time on tall ships. So I learned a lot kind of on bigger vessels. I was comfortable out on the open ocean, but I was not a racer. I didn't know how to do small boat sailing really. I was able to sail with some friends who kind of did a shakedown cruise with me for a couple weeks. And I was very sort of quiet about telling people. I had people like Sandy. I think Sandy had to leave, but to help me out and say like, this is how you use your self-steering gear. And, people helped me with electronics. And I was very quiet about, I don't know about you, but maybe many of you are like, if you say you're going to do something, then you really want to do it. And I didn't want to put myself in that position where I had to do something stupid and I would be afraid to turn back. So I didn't tell that many people about what I wanted to do. Even when I sailed into the Gulf of Maine, I was like, I might turn back, I'll see how it goes. And I was lucky in the Gulf of Maine. I had a little bit of heavy weather, enough to just see am I okay? Is the boat okay? Can I do this? But a lot of the things that I was not good at, like I mentioned, I'd never been a small boat racer. I prepared like I was going to be in a hurricane all the time. But in really light air, I didn't know how to move my boat really. It was really heavy. I brought every imaginable anchor and chain with, because I brought food for about 11 years to be on board. And so my boat was really heavy, and I just didn't know how to move the boat in 2 knots or 3 knots. And so I couldn't set the spinnaker by myself. And so but I do think, and you see that over and over again, these types of people that go out and really do it, is that anybody can do it. It doesn't require great intellect or great experience. You just got to go out there and learn as you go and be open to learning. And one of my favorite people is Teddy Seymour. He was the first black man to sail alone around the world. He grew up in Yonkers, did a little bit of fishing, went to college inland for track. He was a U.S. Marine in Vietnam. And then he got to outside San Diego, and he was like, this sailing thing looks kind of interesting. He was looking, that gentleman said, he was just looking for a place to live. And he was like, maybe I'll live on that boat. Maybe I'll teach this sailing thing. He's like, all right, well, now I got a job in St. Croix as a teacher. Maybe I'll try to sail this thing. And then he did. And then he thought, maybe I'll try to sail around the world by myself. And as another gentleman said, he was trying to find somebody to go with him. And no one would go with him. And he was like, all right, I guess I'm just going to do this by myself. And in the 1980s, for $6,000, he sailed all around the world, a few stops, mostly in the tropical region. And just like Katrina said, totally uneventful voyage, nice people everywhere, very boring narrative, because he was just like, it all worked great. Yeah, okay, sometimes I had some engine problems. He was careful. He knew what he was doing. He sailed alone. People were extraordinarily nice. He was moved by all the people that he met throughout the world. And he came back, and he died last year. And nobody knows about him. He's like, there was no obituary. The only obituary was in St. Croix, where he lived for most of his life. Born in Yonkers, Marine veteran. No obituary in any U.S. newspaper.
It reminds me of something Captain Adrian Lane, who used to live right over there, and that's his chart right up on the wall there. That he made that on the Woods Hole boat right after the war. He was doing the research. Anyway, Captain Lane, Jonathan's father, and Chris and Craig. He said to me when I first knew him, he says, he's one of those, guys. He says, all those sea stories, they're all about people that screwed up. You don't have a story until somebody screws up. It's like with the guy you're talking about. No hits, no runs, no errors. Yeah. What was that? That was my father's joke about old maids. Anyway, anybody else? Yes, Mary.
I forgot to say that we learned to sail basically from Slocum's book. You read that book very carefully. It tells you how to handle the boat in any circumstance. And it works, just like he says it does.
Okay, I think we're done with this part. Now you're free to move about the country.
Let's.
And
Thanks a lot for coming. Really appreciate it.
Okay.